Right now, while you're watching this, 4 companies control more of the world's grain than most countries do. You didn't vote for them. You've probably never heard their names. But they decide whether bread gets more expensive in London, whether rice runs short in Manila, and whether a farmer in Iowa makes rent this year. Before we get into it, hit that like button and subscribe, because this one's going to change how you look at your grocery bill. Alright, let's get into it. So here's the thing nobody tells you about food. We like to think it's simple. Farmer grows wheat, wheat becomes bread, bread ends up on your table. Clean, local, human. But that's not really how it works anymore. Hasn't been for decades. Food today moves through a handful of choke points, controlled by a small number of countries and an even smaller number of companies, and when something goes wrong at one of those choke points, the whole world feels it. Let's start with grain, because grain is the backbone of everything. Wheat, corn, rice, soybeans, these 4 crops alone feed more people than anything else on the planet. And when you look at who actually exports them, the list is shockingly short. Russia and Ukraine, before the war, were shipping out close to 1/3 of the world's wheat between them. Countries in the Middle East and North Africa, Egypt, Lebanon, Yemen, were buying most of it. So when the war broke out in 2022, it wasn't just a European story. Bread prices spiked in Cairo. Bakeries in Beirut started rationing. People who had nothing to do with that war were suddenly standing in longer lines for flour. Then there's the United States, still the single biggest exporter of corn and soybeans on Earth. A few states in the Midwest, Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, are quietly feeding a huge chunk of the planet's livestock, because most of that corn isn't going into your cereal bowl, it's going into animal feed. Which means American weather, American trade policy, even American election year politics, ripple straight through to the price of chicken in a market in Jakarta. Brazil's the other giant most people underestimate. It's become the world's top soybean exporter, mostly feeding China's enormous appetite for pork. To do that, Brazil has cleared staggering amounts of the Amazon and the Cerrado for farmland. So next time someone in Beijing buys a cheap pork chop, there's a decent chance a piece of rainforest paid for it. But here's where it gets interesting. It's not really countries pulling the strings. It's 4 companies, so powerful and so quietly run that traders just call them the ABCD Group. Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. Between them, they're estimated to control somewhere around 70 to 90% of the global grain trade. Cargill alone, a private company most people couldn't pick out of a lineup, pulls in more revenue every year than entire countries. These 4 don't grow the wheat. They don't need to. They own the ships, the ports, the silos, the pipelines that move food from farm to plate. Which means they see the shortages before anyone else does. They see the price swings coming, and they position themselves accordingly, long before it ever makes the news. So when a headline says global food prices are rising, what's actually happening is a handful of boardrooms deciding what the rest of us pay for dinner. And it's not just grain. Fertilizer, fishing fleets, even the seeds themselves. The deeper you dig, the more it looks less like a global marketplace and more like a small, tightly held network with almost everyone else just along for the ride. And that's just grain. Wait until you hear who actually controls the world's fertilizer supply, because without it, none of this even grows in the first place. Fertilizer is the part nobody thinks about until it's gone. And when you trace it back, it comes down to 3 things: nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium. Nitrogen's mostly made using natural gas, so whoever controls cheap gas controls cheap fertilizer. That's Russia again, and to a lesser extent China. Phosphate is even more concentrated. Morocco alone sits on something like 70% of the world's known phosphate reserves. Not Saudi Arabia with oil, not Russia with gas. Morocco, a country most people couldn't find on a map, holds the key ingredient every single farm on Earth needs to keep soil productive. And potassium, or potash, mostly comes out of 2 places: Canada and Belarus. When Western sanctions hit Belarus a few years back, potash exports got squeezed, and farmers as far away as Brazil and India felt it within a season. Less potash meant lower yields, which meant higher prices, which meant a family in Lagos paying more for a bag of rice because of a political decision made in Minsk. This is the part that should really sit with you. Food security isn't really about food. It's about a chain of raw materials, shipping lanes, and a handful of governments that most consumers never think about, all lined up perfectly, and if just one link slips, everyone downstream pays for it. Now let's talk about the ocean, because it's the same story with a different cast. China runs the largest fishing fleet on the planet by a wide margin. Thousands of vessels, many operating far outside Chinese waters, off the coasts of West Africa, South America, even near the Galapagos. Local fishermen in Senegal or Ghana, whose families have fished those waters for generations, are now competing with industrial fleets backed by state subsidies. They simply can't compete, and entire coastal economies have been reshaped because of it. Then there's seeds, maybe the least talked about, most important piece of all. A tiny group of companies, Bayer, Cordova, ChemChina, and a couple of others, control a massive share of the world's commercial seed supply. That means when a farmer in India or Kenya plants a crop, there's a real chance the seed itself, and often the fertilizer and pesticide that go with it, all trace back to the same small circle of corporations. Farming, something that's supposed to be about independence and land, has quietly become dependent on a handful of global suppliers. So put it all together. Grain moves through 4 trading giants. Fertilizer runs through Russia, Morocco, Canada, and Belarus. Fishing is dominated by a handful of massive industrial fleets. Seeds trace back to a tiny cluster of agribusiness companies. None of this is a conspiracy. Nobody's hiding it. It's just not something that makes headlines until a war, a drought, or a shipping blockade forces the issue into view. But it means something as basic as a loaf of bread on your table is actually the end result of a fragile, tightly wound chain stretching across a dozen countries. And if any one link in that chain breaks, you feel it in your wallet within weeks, sometimes days. And that's the uncomfortable truth about food security in 2026. It was never really about how much food the world can grow. The planet produces more than enough calories to feed everyone twice over. It's about who controls the pipes those calories move through, and right now, that control sits in fewer hands than most people would ever guess.